Have you ever felt a pull towards another woman that awakens something difficult to name? What if your attraction isn't appearing out of nowhere? What if it's been there all along? Many women move through years, sometimes decades, assuming they already know the shape of their sexuality. They date men, they build relationships, they follow the script they were given, and sometimes that script fits, but sometimes something doesn't quite settle. Deep down, you have a failing, a curiosity, a reaction that lingers longer than expected, a friendship that feels unusually intense, a woman who stays in your thoughts long after she's gone. And here's what's actually true, backed by research and decades of careful science. For many women, attraction to other women does not arrive as a sudden revelation. It arrives as a recognition of something that was already there before the language existed for it, before the question had ever been asked. Let me start with something most of us were never taught. Attraction is not a single event. It is not a switch that flips. It is a layered, contextual, biological and emotional process, shaped by experience, relationship, memory, and the social environment we grew up in. The American Psychological Association defines sexual orientation as an enduring pattern of emotional, romantic, and sexual attraction. Emotional, romantic, sexual. Those three things do not always arrive together. They do not always point in the same direction, and they do not always announce themselves clearly. There is also an important distinction, one that clinical psychology now makes very clearly, between sexual orientation, which describes the underlying pattern of who you are drawn to, and sexual identity, the label you use to understand yourself. Orientation tends to be stable. Identity, the story we tell about ourselves, can take years to catch up. This is not a sign of confusion. It is a sign that self-knowledge takes time, and there is no deadline attached to this. In 2004, a psychologist named Meredith Chivers at Queen's University conducted a study that has been replicated multiple times since, and whose implications are still being discussed by researchers. She measured both the physiological arousal and the subjective reports of attraction in women and men across different sexual orientations. What she found was striking. Men's physiological arousal is what researchers call category-specific. Heterosexual men respond strongly to female stimuli. Gay men respond strongly to male stimuli. Their bodies and their self-reports align fairly closely. Women's arousal works differently. Heterosexual women, women who identified as straight and reported attraction only to men, showed measurable physiological responses to both male and female stimuli. Their subjective desire was specific. Their physical response was more broad. This doesn't mean heterosexual women secretly want women. What it suggests is that women's arousal systems are more context-sensitive, more relational, and more connected to the presence of intimacy and safety than to the gender of a partner. But it does offer one possible explanation for something many women have described as sexual fluidity. In 1997, a developmental psychologist at the University of Utah named Lisa Diamond began following a group of young women over time. She tracked them for 10 years. She asked them, at regular intervals, how they understood their own sexuality. What she found reshaped the field. Over those 10 years, 2/3 of the women changed the identity label they had started with, some more than once. The most popular identity by the end of the study was not lesbian or bisexual. It was unlabeled, not because these women were uncertain, but because their experience was richer, more complex, more contextual than any single word had been designed to hold. Diamond was careful to say something important. Sexual orientation is not chosen. The women in her study did not experience their shifts as willful. They experienced them as recognition, not discovery, recognition. The same woman, the same underlying self, finally in possession of the language to describe her own interior life. Diamond also found that this kind of fluidity is not the same as instability. It is not confusion. The research supports bisexual and fluid identities as genuine, stable orientations, not transitional stages on the way to something more definitive. Now I want to talk about something that affects almost every woman, one way or another. Most of us grew up in a world that assumed heterosexuality. Films showed it. Families expected it. The question, "Is there a boy you like?" asked at age 7, already contains an entire architecture of assumption. In 1980, the poet and feminist scholar Adrienne Rich wrote a now famous essay in which she argued that heterosexuality isn't simply natural for women, it is also socially enforced, culturally maintained, and structurally assumed. She called it compulsory heterosexuality. Her work is political theory, not clinical science. But subsequent research in psychology, particularly work on how heteronormative environments shape identity development, has provided real empirical support for her core observation. When one path is presented as inevitable, alternatives don't simply disappear, they become harder to see. Psychologist Roy Baumeister reviewed decades of research in 2000 and proposed that female sexuality is more erotically plastic than male sexuality, meaning it is more responsive to social context, cultural framing, and relational experience. This means the environment we grow up in does not simply influence how we express sexuality. It shapes whether we can even recognize it in ourselves. Some women spent years evaluating whether a man was attractive without ever stopping to ask whether they were attracted. There is a difference. One is observation, the other is desire. For some women, attraction to other women is present from early adolescence, unmistakable, uncomplicated in its certainty, if not in its expression. For others, it arrives later, after a marriage, after decades of a life that looked, from the outside, perfectly settled. After therapy creates enough space to hear one's own voice. After a friendship becomes something else entirely. The research is clear on this point. Late discovery does not mean late creation. It means late access. The orientation was likely always present. What changed were the conditions that made recognition possible. When that recognition arrives, it rarely arrives as one clean emotion. There is often grief, for years spent understanding yourself through the wrong frame. Relief, because certain experiences suddenly make sense. Joy, sometimes enormous, sometimes tentative. And fear of what it means, of who knows, of what changes. All of those reactions are normal. All of them have been documented. None of them require an apology. You don't need to arrive at a label. You don't need to explain yourself to anyone. You don't need to be certain before you are allowed to be curious. Whether the word that fits is lesbian, or bisexual, or queer, or questioning, or none of the above, the only thing that matters is that it is yours.